right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar in our April Land Managers Toolbox webinar workshop series. Today's presentations are going to focus on our forest lands here in Arkansas and managing those for wildlife. We're going to be specifically looking at what our forest lands are, kind of why they're important, and what are some of the species that we have that depend on them. And then look at some ways that we can better manage our forest lands for optimum wildlife benefits. And then at the end, we'll also take a look at some assistance that's available to landowners who are looking to manage their forests. Your presenters this evening are myself. I'm Jessica Cox. I'm a Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist for West Central Arkansas. And we also have Katrina Sims with us. And Katrina is the Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist in kind of the northwest, north central part of the state. But before we begin, I would just like to go over a couple of quick housekeeping items. So first, this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded to our Quail Forever in Arkansas YouTube page. You can also view all of the other webinars that we've done in this series on that page as well. There's a playlist that's titled Land Managers Toolbox webinars, so you can go on there. If you've missed any to date, you can go on there and check those videos out. And then lastly, we will have a chance for questions and answers at the very end of the presentation. However, in the meantime, if you have any questions that you think of throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will be answering those questions at the end of the presentation. So I guess we'll go ahead and jump into the presentation. So Katrina's going to start us off this evening with a discussion about the importance of forest lands and some of the species that use them. So take it away, Katrina.
Hi, everybody. My name is Katrina Sims, and I'm just going to go ahead and shut my camera off here just because it makes the presentation sometimes go a little bit smoother since we also have so many people on here. So I'm just going to go ahead and shut my camera off there. And with that, we're going to get started. So hold on, my slideshow's not wanting to, oh, there we go. So we're going to start with what are forest lands. So most of you know what a forest land is, but for any of you that don't, it's just a ecosystem that's dominated by your trees, and there could be some, vegetation under the ground. Here in Arkansas, we have a lot of overgrown forest. So we have bottomland forest, and we have our more uplands forest with our oak savanna. So this picture here on your left is more of a oak woodland here, not quite. It needs to be a little bit thinner. And then here in the middle is one of our bottomland forests. So that has a lot of some parts of the years it'll have water in there, and some parts it'll be dry. This part that doesn't really have any vegetation growing, there's probably water recently in that area, and it's just kind of receded back, and you can see there in the back there's a little bit more herbaceous growth there on the ground. And over here on our right we have more of a pine woodland mix up here. And so that's kind of the different forest types that we have here in Arkansas. And there's a number of different animals that inhabit those, and things that we can do to benefit those that we're going to learn throughout this presentation. And then we're going to talk about, so why are some of our forests important? There's a number of different reasons. So one of the big things is, there's all the different animals and wildlife that inhabit them, and they're all their different ecosystem types, and just all the requirements. But there's also a lot more things. You have your commercial timber production. So anybody that's managing their timber for commercial property, monetary value. They also do a lot of ecosystem services. So they prevent soil erosion, improve and maintain water quality, carbon sequestration, and they improve air quality. And they also just provide us with really nice things to look at too, especially with all of our the Ozark St. Francis Forest here and the Ouachita National Forest. We have a lot of really pretty forests in Arkansas that we can go travel around and look at. So here in Arkansas, as earlier I mentioned those pictures, we have our hardwood forest, we have white oak hickory components. We also have pines. We have a hardwood pine mix, so that's more of a mix, other than it's not really dominated by one or the other. And then we have our closed canopy forest systems. So we're going to talk a little bit about each kind of those here today, and ways to manage them. So the closed canopy forest systems, they kind of have low productivity in some ways. They're not the best for a lot of our wildlife that we have here, especially the upland closed canopies. They should be more of woodlands or savanna, so they should be a lot more thinner and open. Bottomland hardwood forests are closed canopy, and that's just the way they function. So they're a little bit different than our uplands here. So we're just going to move on to here. So here on this picture here on the left, so that's what a lot of our forests here, especially up here in the northwest section, look like, is our closed canopy systems. If you look on the ground, there's not really much going on there. You might see a little ferns here or there, a few little things popping up. But as you can see in this picture, there's very little sunlight getting to the forest floor. So you don't really have much of a forest floor or even a midsection. You just have canopy in the top. So you have very little productivity. Also, that being said, there's very little that for a lot of different wildlife that can sustain there. Like, yeah, you might have some deer in there, probably some hogs running around, maybe some few other little critters that are on the ground. But as far as being productive for a large number, it's not going to be. You're going to have a lot of your ground nesting birds that can't really utilize it for too much because there's just nothing for them to use for cover, or they can't nest down there. Something's going to see them and come and get them right away. Then up here we have an oak woodland. So this actually is what most of our forests should look like, but through years of just mismanagement and people and agencies as a whole not doing a lot, we've had a lot of fire suppression, in the past, and we're just recently starting to come out of that, and people and agencies are starting to do a lot more management and burning and stuff. So this as a whole is what our forest, a big portion of our forest here in Arkansas should look like. We have a lot of wildflowers growing and other herbaceous grasses and forbs growing. It's great for wildlife, for food sources, for nesting and everything else. And then here, this picture is actually a shortleaf pine woodland, and this particular picture was taken from the Ouachitas, and it's actually used. It's got a lot of big blue stem growing in it, because it's actually used for this little guy right here in the middle, this red cockaded woodpecker. He's actually one of the species that we have here in Arkansas. They are endangered. And so this particular forest over here has been managed specifically for these guys because they require a lot of larger pines that are thinner, so like your woodland setting with a lot of grass and forbs growing. And they are a large reason why they are endangered is because they just have so much habitat loss over their range that they cover. And so the Ouachita National Forest down there, they've been doing a lot of great work, and they've actually seen some really good increase in numbers in the last several years. Since 2013, they've had about a 200% increase in the numbers of red cockaded woodpeckers throughout about 60 different territories, excuse me. And so not only is this habitat that these guys are in, but it's also good for quail, a lot of your other ground nesting birds, and deer, turkey, and just any wildlife can use this. It's not just specifically for this red cockaded woodpecker, but it's great that we're able to restore it and get it going for them. But it's much more functional. These two types of woodlands are much more functional for a larger amount of wildlife species than this closed canopy forest. Like, it serves its purpose, but even in this picture, you can tell that this one tree right here in the middle, so historically, this probably was a much more open site and probably looks something closer to this, or at least somewhat more open than what it is, because there's so many smaller trees through here that are just overgrown. They're really tall and spindly. They don't really have any lower branches because they're all trying to reach up and get to that canopy level to get that sunlight. And this tree has obviously been here much longer than these other ones. So it had, a chance to grow and get larger because it was more open at one point, and just through not being managed over the years, it's grown up into this closed canopy system, and it just needs to be managed. And so that's what we're going to learn here today. A little farther on, we're going to learn how to manage our forests, and that way they can be more beneficial for wildlife and other things as well. So a lot of you, I don't know if any of you turkey hunt, but right now turkey season is just getting opened here in Arkansas. So a lot of people are out in the woods turkey hunting, and a lot of people, are really big into that and everything. Well, in this picture here, if you're a turkey, you're going to be, especially we're getting ready to come up to nesting season. So here we have on the left, you have more of your closed canopy system, just a little bit of growth on here on the ground. And then over here, we have more probably a woodland or a savanna that has a lot of herbaceous growth on the forest floor. And when our hens get ready to nest here, you would much rather be nesting here on the right because the predators can't see you. It's going to be much harder for them to get to the nest. Whereas here, the hen's just kind of a sitting duck, and any predator that comes on by can see her and they can get to her nest and everything else. And you can see here, there's a hen right here. And unless you're really up on top of her, you probably wouldn't be able to see her very well. But you have to get real close. So that's really good for predators. So for turkey production, for any people that are into turkeys and wildlife in general, having more of a woodland setting or savanna is much more beneficial to them than having a closed canopy system. Not saying that they can't be in those areas, because sometimes you will find them in their areas, but this is going to be much more beneficial for hiding their eggs, for raising their poults, because here they might be able to find a few bugs here and there, but here they're going to be, whenever you have a lot more grasses and forbs growing, you're going to have a lot more insects because they're there to pollinate. And, there's just a lot more stuff going around in that area. So the little poults are going to have places that they can hide. They're going to have places that they can forage for bugs and seeds and everything else. Where here, the little poult being out there, just something's going to come by and snatch it up, because everything loves to eat like little baby turkeys, and quail too, because quail really do really well in these type of woodlands or savanna settings. So, and, everything else as well too. So not just because we're managing for one thing doesn't mean that it doesn't beneficial a lot of things for people that want to manage. Just for some people who are just interested in managing for deer or turkey or bear, whatever. But usually when you manage for one thing, you improve habitat for a number of other things. So, and like I was saying here above, just because you're managing for one, there's a number of different things that when you improve your forest health as a whole, you get things like you're managing for your black bears. Here's another cockaded woodpecker. You have all your amphibians and reptiles. You have all your different bugs and insects. More grasses, more forbs means more pollinators. More pollinators and insects means more birds. If you have a lot more open stuff, especially your ground nesting birds, they're going to be doing a lot well. There's a lot of songbirds that do a lot better with your more open canopies instead of these closed canopy systems. If they can't really fly around very easily and find insects that are around pollinating all of the forbs and grasses and stuff, then you're not going to have very many birds there, just because there's nothing for them to eat. So the more we manage our forest systems, the better it's going to be for everything as a whole. So now, other than wildlife, some of the other things that our forests are really good for is for our water and air quality and soil erosion. So this is a pretty good little diagram I found here online that depicts it pretty well. So here on the left, we have more of a healthier forest system. So, the rain's going to come down. If you don't have any trees, you have a lot of erosion issues, because the trees help slow down your rainfall. They just disperse it a lot better. Also, you have all the roots of the trees and any of the other vegetation that's growing underneath them. So that allows the water to infiltrate into the surface and actually soak in and be able to reach it down to your groundwater, as opposed to if there's no trees, you're probably not going to have a lot of vegetation in some cases. And so you're just going to have a lot of runoff. And so it's going to end up running off. And eventually it's just going to cause erosion issues, which carries a lot of sedimentation and other things down into our water sources that eventually we drink. And so, having your trees here, much more better for that. Also air quality. So the trees, they have a lot of area with their branches and leaves and stuff. And so they collect a lot of particles out of the air that land on the leaves, and the snow must take them up and kind of clean the air. Also, if you have any kind of larger particles that are getting blown around in the air, if you have trees or a forest that is there's like a windbreak, they're going to cut down on any of that, that wind that's pushing all of those particles in the air, as opposed to if there's nothing there acting as a windbreaker to stop it. If there's a bunch of dirt particles that get picked up, there's nothing to stop it. It's just going to keep on traveling. It's not going to get stopped and kind of blocked by the forest. And so that kind of helps with your your soil, water, and air quality, all kind of the same type of system. You know, the roots are there, your trees are there, stops the wind, the water is able to infiltrate and go down into the soil. You know, the roots act as a sponge to kind of absorb all that stuff. Also, not only is the water able to infiltrate into the soil better, but the roots actually sometimes will kind of act as a sponge, as I said, and remove some of that harmful stuff that could be in the water that could eventually end up in the water source that we're drinking. So it's just really beneficial to have trees around and manage them properly instead of like clear cutting everything or just having unmanaged forests. Also, for any forest areas that have streams that are close to them, it's actually really good for the aquatic wildlife too that are in the stream. So the trees can provide shade, which help moderate the temperature of the streams that are next. And also, as you have leaves and other debris that falls in from the trees, it breaks down and creates organic matter that then some of your aquatic life can feed on. And it provides good habitat and nutrients that way to other aquatic life. The other things that our forests are really good about is carbon sequestration. So for anybody that doesn't know what carbon sequestration is, essentially trees take in CO2 out of the atmosphere. And since trees are relatively long-lived, they can store it for a very long time before it, if the tree dies or if it burns, it will it'll decompose or it'll eventually get back into the atmosphere. But trees can be alive for several hundred years, so that's several hundred years of carbon that is getting taken out of our atmosphere, and it's not adding to the atmosphere to further increase global warming the atmosphere up. So the more trees we can have that we can manage properly the forest, the better they're going to be at taking carbon out. And they will take carbon out. For younger trees can take in more carbon, but as they get older, they take it in more. It's a more stable carbon, so it doesn't fluctuate as much, and they're just going to store it. Once they reach about a certain age, they'll just store that amount of carbon, and it'll be there until that tree either, like I said, dies, it decomposes, or it burns up or something. So the carbon sequestration is a really good thing that our forests also provide us with, along with all the other stuff that we've kind of talked about earlier on in the presentation. So with that kind of concludes my part of the wildlife and a few of the ecosystem services that our forests offer us. And now we're going to move in more to forest management and the different practices that landowners can do to further improve their forest productivity and the productivity that wildlife can use them and the amount of wildlife that we can have in our forest instead of having just forests that aren't managed properly and they're not really doing a lot. So we're going to turn it back over to Jessica.
All right. Thank you, Katrina. Just one moment. Let me get my screen shared. Okay. Katrina, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All righty. But yeah, thank you for that presentation, Katrina. So I just want to mention briefly that in the recorded webinars that I mentioned at the beginning, there is one that goes into a little bit more detail on our forest lands here in Arkansas. If you're interested in checking that webinar out, again, you can find that on our Quail Forever in Arkansas YouTube page. But we're just going to keep moving right along. So now that you hopefully got a little bit better understanding of our forest lands and some of the wildlife that depend on them, I want to take a quick look at some of the ways that we can manage our forest lands with these species of wildlife in mind. So for this presentation, I've kind of broken the management process up into 3 main steps. So we have planning, implementation, and then monitoring and management. And we'll go through each of these steps and kind of discuss what they are and what we try to accomplish during each of these steps to get to that the final goal that we're looking for, like Katrina said, having those nice open woodland conditions that can support a large diversity of wildlife. So the first step in any project is planning. So planning really allows us to put what we want, what we have, and then how we plan to get what we want into a more organized and documented form. So Alexander Graham Bell, he said that before anything else, preparation is the key to success. And I really think that this statement holds true for habitat management, especially in our forest lands. So some of the planning basics that we'll go over include outlining objectives, completing resource inventories, writing a management plan and kind of what all that entails, and then go over some other considerations that we need to think about during the planning process. And then also looking at some of the planning participants. So who all is involved in the planning, who's making decisions, who's making recommendations. So number one, that's you. It's your property. You're going to be the one that's ultimately deciding what exactly happens there. Family members can become important if you are hoping to one day pass the property off to your children, or perhaps the property is in a family trust. Those family members that are involved need to be actively participating in that planning. And then you've got biologists, you've got foresters, other specialists, so wetland specialists, soil specialists that all get involved in this process. I have neighbors down here because I think that that's one that gets left out a lot. And while your neighbors may not be as directly involved in the planning process, there are some practices that we do. Prescribed burning as an example, where we do have to take neighbors and their concerns into consideration. And those concerns should be outlined in our planning, in our management plan. So objectives. So defining objectives is critical for any plan, but especially in forests. So think about what you envision the property looking like and what you envision being able to do on the property. So those are going to be your goals and objectives. So management of these sites is going to vary greatly depending on the goals and objectives that you set. So here I've listed out some of the more common objectives that I have heard from landowners while helping them plan their forest projects. Now, I highly encourage you all to really take some time and think about what you want your objectives to be. So again, because the implementation and management of sites can vary greatly depending on these objectives, it really shouldn't be a quick and easy decision. So take your time, choose those objectives wisely, because you also have to remember that forests and forest lands take much longer to heal from these wounds or mistakes than some of our other land uses that we plan projects on. So, trees typically take decades to grow. So if we make a mistake, then it's going to take decades to fix that mistake. So really take your time, decide exactly what you want from the land, and then go from there. So some of these common objectives include wildlife habitat, commercial production, which we're really not going to go into too much detail on the commercial side of forest management during this. We're really going to focus more on managing for wildlife and for forest health. But later on, we'll talk about some assistance that you can get if commercial production does happen to be one of your goals for your property, but also carbon sequestration, like Katrina talked about, fruit and mast production, wildfire hazard reduction, and then recreational use. So hunting, hiking, camping, it's very popular here in Arkansas. So a lot of people have those types of things in mind when they're trying to figure out what exactly they want to do with their forest land. So again, take your time, choose those wisely. And there might be other objectives that you have besides the one I have listed here. You can have one objective, you can have 15 objectives. That's totally up to you. And I think once you get further in the planning process, you'll realize that a lot of these objectives work hand in hand. So for example, there might be one practice that we can use, such as prescribed burning, and by utilizing that, we can actually achieve multiple objectives with the same practice. However, on the other hand, there are also objectives that don't quite align 100% together. So wildlife habitat and commercial production or timber harvesting seems to be a really good example of that. A lot of times people think that you can't manage for wildlife and manage for commercial production at the same time. And you absolutely can. You know, there are issues that we run into with that. So for example, typically a lot of times the minimum basal area, which I'll go into what basal area is, the way that we measure the density of our forest lands, and I'll explain that here in a little bit. But often that minimum basal area that we look for commercial production is higher than the maximum basal area that we want to see for optimum wildlife habitat. So they don't align 100%, but if you have both of those in objectives, it's still doable. You might just have to compromise on both ends to make sure that you're achieving both of those goals. So resource inventory. So after you have decided what your goals are, what your objectives are for the property, it's time to conduct a resource inventory. So this is simply going out to the property, looking at it and seeing what you've got. So this is the real boots on the ground part of the planning process. So you're getting out there, you're looking at your trees, you're looking at the landscape, documenting all of this information, documenting those benchmark or the existing conditions. So what's out there right now on the ground, getting stand descriptions. So you're going to want to look, take into account, look at things like aspect and slope, fuel loads, all of that kind of stuff, getting the current basal area of those stands. What are the dominant species? Are there any invasive species? Or what are the undesirable species that you're wanting to get rid of? And then also looking at indicators of historic site characteristics. So for the most part, what we're doing when we're out here conducting these inventories is we're looking at the landscape, and there's clues all around us. And that is our job as professionals, as biologists and foresters, to help find those clues on your property to give us an idea of what that area would have historically looked like. So was it an open woodland? Was it a savanna? Was it at one point maybe even an open grassland or prairie? So there's still little clues on the landscape that can help point us in the right direction. So that's where we as biologists and foresters can come in and start helping you during this stage to go out with you, conduct a site visit, help you collect that data, because we really know what to look for, so we can help decide what course of action to take to reach your objectives. So then the management plan. So once the resource inventory is done, we're going to come back and we're going to take all that data that we've collected and we're going to create a management plan. So this plan is going to define your goals and objectives. And it's really important to make sure that you try to set your goals as quantitative as possible. And because we're going to use that to measure success. So after the implementation of the practices, we need to go out and we need to look and say, hey, were we successful in doing and in meeting our goals and objectives? So for example, one of your objectives might be to reduce the fuel load. Okay, well, we can put that in a quantitative form by saying, I want to reduce the fuel load by 50%. So once we go out and conduct a prescribed burn, we can then go out and assess that burn and determine whether or not we actually met that goal and objective. So putting those goals in quantitative form really helps us to measure our successes and our failures as well, because things don't always go according to plan. These management plans, we will also provide recommendations. So again, based on that data that we collect, we will recommend specific practices that you can utilize to help meet your goals and objectives, and also a timeline of the work that needs to be done in order to get there. They'll have maps and supporting documents, so maps showing where the practices are, soils maps, topo maps, wetlands maps, any kind of map you can think of. We can help gather that information so that you have a very clear picture of what you have and what's going on. And again, these are written by the biologists or foresters that have been out there to do the resource inventory and have been out to the property. But an important thing to remember is that these plans should be fluid. So they shouldn't be so put in a box that it's really rigid and there's really not a lot of flexibility. So habitat management is very adaptive. It's adaptive management. Things change. A lot of the things that we do are weather dependent, which we have absolutely no control over, especially here in Arkansas. So we really want to make sure that we're not getting ourselves into too small of a box. And a good plan should take time to complete. It should be thorough, and there shouldn't be any confusion. You should be able to pick up that plan and look at it and know exactly what it is you need to do to achieve your goals and objectives. So you want in this plan for it to tell you how to go from this to something more like this, because this is one of the ultimate goals that we're looking for when managing our forest lands. And a couple of other considerations that we need to think about while during that planning process. So the labor source. So who's going to be doing the work? Some of this work is very time consuming. So are you going to be able to do the work yourself with the help of maybe some friends or family, or do you need to hire a vendor or a contractor to come out and do the work for you? Before you ever pick up a tool or anything to do any work, you need to make sure you know how all of that is going to go down. Also, cost. So some of these practices can be more costly than others. There's different methods that are more costly than others. So before you start, again, figuring up a cost estimate. What are your out-of-pocket expenses going to be? And then also, this is when you might want to start looking into cost share opportunities that are available to landowners through both federal and state programs to help with some of that financial burden of actually implementing the practices in your plan. Time is another one. So typically, most of our projects range from about 3 to 5 years for implementation. So that's to get all of the practices in your plan completed. Typically takes about 3 to 5 years. So that's a pretty significant amount of time. However, once you have all the practices implemented, it's really a lifetime of management. So this is definitely not a put it on the ground and walk away type of situation. Our forest lands require continual management. So once you jump in that boat, it's a lifelong commitment. So you need to make sure that you're prepared to do that. And then there's special environmental considerations that we always need to be on the lookout for, again, because hopefully wildlife is definitely one of your objectives when managing your forest lands. So Arkansas has many species has many threatened and endangered species across the state. When looking at forest lands, bats are the first ones that pop into my head, especially when managing forests. Arkansas has several species of listed bats. And when we're doing any type of forest disturbance, tree disturbance, we need to make sure that we're avoiding specific times of the year when the bats are pupping, because they will actually utilize our tree for our trees for that. And also cultural resources. So that's a little Indiana bat is one of our listed species here in Arkansas that we find, especially in this part of the state and in the north part of the state. They're very little, but they do utilize our trees for pupping. So we want to make sure that we're not disturbing those guys. And also cultural resources. So Arkansas has a lot of cultural resources, Native American burial grounds or ceremony sites, cave dwellings, and also old historic home sites or shelters. So we need to be conscious of those when we're implementing these practices, making sure that we're not disturbing or damaging anything of cultural significance. And again, just make sure you cover all of your bases, and all of this stuff should be detailed and outlined in your plan. So now we get to the fun part, which is implementing the plan. So you've planned, you have your written management plan, everything's laid out. Now you're actually ready to get out there, get your hands dirty, and get to work. So an old Irish proverb that I really like, and you'll notice that I like using quotes, but it's you'll never plow a field by turning it over in your mind. So you may have this great plan and vision for your property and these goals that you want to achieve, and you have a management plan that's been written, and that's all great, but you're not going to get anywhere with just that. You actually need to get out there and start implementing these practices. So now we're going to go into some best management practices, or I'll refer to them from now on as BMPs, that we commonly use in our forest systems. But I want to start by saying each forest site is specific. So there are going to be special considerations for each site. So what we're fixing to go through are generalizations. They're general common practices that we utilize. But if you're interested in doing any of these practices, I would highly recommend getting that biologist or getting that forester out to your property to help get those site-specific recommendations put into a plan. But we're going to talk a little bit about forest stand improvement, prescribed burning, and fire breaks. Those are perhaps the two most common practices that we use to enhance our forests. But I also want to mention some others that I think are heavily underused and that I think we should be implementing more of. And that's glade restoration, forest openings, edge feathering, and snag creation. So forest stand improvement, what is it? So forest stand improvement is the selective removal of trees within forest lands to create more open conditions. So some objectives that you may have when you're, saying we're going to do forest stand improvement is to reduce the basal area. So here after this slide, I'm going to go over basal area in a little bit more detail. But for wildlife, we're specifically looking at about a 20 to 40 basal area for wildlife. So those are pretty thin conditions. And what that's going to do is it's going to increase light to the ground, which is going to also increase the amount of herbaceous vegetation, like our grasses and our wildflowers, that's able to grow through our forest lands. And that vegetation is going to provide great forage, nesting, and cover for our wildlife. We can also use this practice to remove invasive and undesirable species. And in doing so, that's really going to allow us to shift that species composition back to those historic conditions that we were talking about earlier. So, if we go out there in the resource inventory and we're like, well, this site and what we're seeing was indicative of an open woodland, we can use forest stand improvement to shift that species composition and shift that density back to those more open woodland conditions. So how is it done? So there's a few common methods that we use. Again, the method that you would want to utilize on your property is going to need to be determined through that management plan, through that resource inventory. But the three most common ones are what we call single stem chemical, which you might have heard referred to as hack and squirt. So this is essentially when you are girdling the tree with a hatchet or a machete, you're cutting into that cambium layer all the way around the tree, and you're applying an appropriate herbicide directly into those cuts. So you're killing the tree, but it's still going to be standing for a while. Next, we have single stem hand tool, which we refer to as cut and drop. So this is like going out with your chainsaw and actually just cutting the tree down and either letting it lay to be burned up through a prescribed burn or to decompose, provide a little bit of habitat, or you can pile them up and try to burn them. That makes it go a little bit quicker. Hardwood species, once you cut them down, most of them will resprout after being cut, especially younger trees. So we want to make sure that we go back and treat those stumps with an appropriate chemical to keep them from resprouting. Because again, the goal is to kill the tree, not to just set its growth back. We actually want to kill that tree. Other species like cedar, they don't tend to resprout once they're cut, as long as you cut them below that lowest living limb. So you should just be good with just cutting those down. And I like that method for cedar removal, because we can then, and we'll talk about that practice, that edge feathering practice, we can then utilize those drop cedars to create additional habitat later on down the road, which I really like. And then we have mechanical removal. So this, when I say mechanical, I'm more talking about mulching. So a mulcher is a machine that you can go out into the woods and it will turn trees essentially into mulch. They're on the ground. So it'll mulch the tree up and just spread the mulch out on the ground. Then you can follow that up with a prescribed burn to help burn all that up. Again, even with mulching, because it's still essentially just cutting the tree. You still will have to go in with the appropriate herbicide if you're mulching hardwoods to make sure that those are not going to resprout. There are pros and cons definitely to each one. Some of the bigger things we look at obviously is time and money. Those seem to be the two of the biggest limiting factors when talking about this stuff. The single stem chemical, so the hack and squirt, oftentimes seems to be the most so it's the cheapest. However, it is very labor intensive. So if you're trying to do this work yourself, be prepared. It's not easy work. It's not fun. It does take significant amount of time because you're having to treat every single individual tree. The chainsaw method, you're starting to go up in price there, but you're starting to kind of speed the process up sometimes. You're actually getting the tree down, so the tree is no longer standing like it is with the hack and squirt method. But again, your costs are starting to rise a little bit. And then with the mulching, you see a pretty significant increase in costs. However, the labor requirements and the time start to go down. So you can kind of see that trend generally as price goes up, labor goes down. So you just have to figure out what works best for you and with your time and your budget. And here's the basal area. So basal area, again, is a way that we measure the density of a forest land. So the basal area of a tree is defined as the cross-sectional area, and it's usually in square feet, of a single tree at breast height. So if you're standing by a tree about breast height or about 4 feet above the ground, that's what we call the DBH, or the diameter at breast height. If you were to take that tree and cut it down at that diameter at breast height, the cross-sectional area of all stems of either a species or all stems within a stand measured at breast height and expressed as per unit of land area, that is your basal area. So to put it kind of, here's a picture real quick, just so you can visualize it a little bit better. It honestly took me longer than I like to admit to get the concept of basal area in my head, because normally I'm like, oh, trees per acre. Trees per acre is not as accurate when we're trying to, when we're talking about forest management. So this graph right here shows 4 different plots, and it's a 60 basal area. So each 4 of these plots are a 60 basal area, but you can obviously see that the plot in the top left-hand corner has significantly more trees in it than the plot in the bottom right-hand corner. And that's because their diameters are different. So that top left plot, those are 6-inch trees. So those are trees that when you stand next to it at breast height, they're going to be 6 inches in diameter. So a 6-inch tree in diameter has less volume than a 14-inch tree in diameter at breast height. So you can see that in a plot, we're looking to get down to 60, but you have most of your trees average 14 inches in diameter. You're going to have much fewer trees per acre than you would if you have 6-inch trees that you're managing for. So just to kind of put it in perspective, again, this is 60 basal area. For wildlife, it's ideally 20 to 40. So you're looking at even lower densities than what you see in this graph. But I was just hoping that might help put it into a little bit better perspective for you. So what are some of the benefits of forest stand improvement? Well, obviously wildlife habitat. So again, we see that increase in available forage, nesting, and cover. And it also reduces the effects of habitat fragmentation, especially for our more savanna and grassland and prairie species like our quail, for example. You know, there's these open grasslands and they're typically surrounded by closed canopy forests that don't really provide anything, and there's, you know, predators. So by managing our forest lands, we can allow these species to have access to other areas and to kind of spread out and move around. So again, reducing the effects of that habitat fragmentation, allowing these individuals to be able to move out into other areas. But also forest health. So as we remove trees on the landscape, the trees, they're going to be competing less for resources. So you're going to get bigger and better trees typically with those lower densities. Wildfire hazard reduction, because you're going to have less fuel load. And then economic value. So again, if you have a commercial objective in mind, healthy trees equal a higher value. And then also if you're managing your property and it looks beautiful and it's aesthetically pleasing and it's got nice timber on it, you can potentially increase the property value or even provide an alternative income source by doing like hunting leases. That seems to be a pretty popular thing here in the state. So that could be another way to generate some revenue to continue the management of the property. And then some other considerations, we mentioned this earlier, but when doing forest stand improvement, when trying to decide, again, when doing that resource inventory, we're going to want to look at slope and aspect of the stand. So south and west facing slopes tend to burn hotter and are less dense. And because of that, the common species that we find are those that are more fire resistant, like your white oaks. Those are a more fire resistant species. So we're typically going to find a higher white oak component on your south and west facing slopes, and vice versa on your north and east facing slopes. They tend to stay wetter, and because they don't get that direct sunlight like the south and west facing slopes do, so they don't burn quite as intense. And so you'll see slightly higher tree densities, and that species composition slightly shifts to kind of favor those less fire resistant species. So when you're talking about oaks like red oaks, so you'll typically see a shift in a more red oak component on those north and east facing slopes. Also looking at soil characteristics is an important thing, knowing what kind of soil you have and what kind of vegetation that those soils will support. And then previous land uses. So if you know an area used to be was clear cut at one point, or has it ever had timber harvested off of it? So knowing those previous land uses are also things to take into consideration when planning this forest stand improvement. And then these are just examples of kind of what we're looking at. So just these open woodland conditions, as you can see in these pictures. Most of them, we've got grasses, you've got wildflowers growing up, growing on the ground that's providing that forage for our wildlife, but there's still forest. These are definitely not pastures with trees. These are forest sites. And then this bottom right picture, that was actually a site up in Northwest Arkansas, and they had gone in and done a bunch of thinning, and they were conducting burns. Of course, the time of year where this picture was taken, there's not much going on, but come the springtime, after they burned this site off, just the grasses and flowers that were growing in this site were phenomenal. And I wish I had a picture of it during the springtime. But this is just, you know, kind of shows you what we're really aiming at. Okay, so now talking about prescribed burning and fire breaks. So prescribed burning is the controlled application of fire under very specific conditions to achieve management objectives. Those objectives could be to manage woody growth or herbaceous growth, reduce fuel loads, remove invasive and undesirable species, and to maintain open forested conditions. So how it's done, or more when it's done, we kind of split our year into two seasons. So dormant season, which it's about November through March. And again, it's all weather dependent, so it could shift one way or the other slightly. But we use these dormant season burns for fuel reduction, post-thinning cleanup. So if you go in and do some forest stand improvement, you can come in post-thinning and do a burn to help clean up some of that debris. For woody control, so some small woody growth that's coming in can help keep that at bay, and to promote herbaceous growth through the forest floor once it's been thinned. Dormant seasons through our woodlands are the most common, that's the most common time when we're going to be burning our forests. Growing season burns, typically August, maybe late July through October. We really use those to control woodies. It's great, you hit them when they're actively growing. It does great at controlling small saplings coming in and cedar trees that are coming in, and then grass suppression. So, you know, you might, once you have your woodlands or your forest into that woodland or savanna, and you've got the grasses growing and you've got the wildflowers, you might look at switching more to a growing season, especially if your grasses start to get a little too thick and out competing your wildflowers. but we do still have to be careful with burning our woods during this time because the trees are actively growing. So you can typically see more tree mortality when doing growing season burns. But again, having a management plan, having a prescribed burn plan that outlines all that is going to reduce the effects of, or reduce the chances of having any tree mortality during that time. So that all goes back to good planning. And then, yeah, the timing and method of burning will depend on site characteristics and your management objectives. Benefits, it's very cost effective. Prescribed burning, there's a lot of vendors out there. There's agencies that will definitely help you to conduct a controlled burn on your property. So it tends to be very cost effective. It benefits wildlife habitat, improves forage quality and availability, and increase those nesting and cover sites. And then by reducing fuel loads and decreasing competition among trees by controlling woody stuff coming in, you're improving your forest health, and then obviously wildfire hazard reduction by reducing those fuel loads every time you go in and create and do a burn. Fire breaks, that's part of prescribed burning. So fire breaks are just areas around a burn unit where combustible fuels have been removed down to mineral soil. So there's a few different types of fire breaks that you can look at putting in. There's dozed lines, so that's going in with a dozer. They're typically about 8 feet wide, but they're not suitable for steep slopes or areas that have very shallow topsoil. We typically see a lot of erosion issues when dealing with dozed lines. Hand lines will work best in places that you can't get a dozed line in. They're typically 5 to 8 feet wide. Trees are cut with a chainsaw and they're moved inside of the unit to be burned. And then you can use a backpack blower or a rake to just remove the leaf litter and debris that's left in about a 5 to 8 foot wide path. Or my favorite type of fire breaks are natural barriers, or things that are already there. The landscape has done the work for us. They should be used whenever possible, again, because when we are looking at doing any type of soil disturbance, even if it's just small, barely scraping the ground, we see erosion issues. So this could be roads, trails, creeks, streams, bluff lines, something that the fire cannot cross. We can utilize those natural areas as fire breaks. But obviously they should be checked and cleared before the burn. So forest openings. So forest openings are small openings within forests where native grasses and forbs can grow. So we're also fixing to talk about glades. So glades are natural forest openings, but we can actually create openings within our forest lands for wildlife to utilize. So, average size of these forested openings would be about 1 acre, and you're looking at about 1 opening for every 40 acres of forest land. And it's as simple as that. You go and you remove all of the trees in an area, and you can go in and if it's been forest land for a long time, chances are by thinning it and with a burn, a lot of those native seeds are still intact in that seed bank is still intact and will come back up on its own. If not, let's say maybe in the past that area had been cleared and was old pasture and you're getting undesirable non-native stuff coming back, you can look at going in and doing a native planting of grasses and wildflowers. And then using site characteristics to determine their location. So, obviously you don't want to go clear all of the trees in an area that might have erosion issues. So using those site characteristics just to kind of place them in areas where it would make sense for them to kind of be. And then moving on to glade restoration. So glades are one of my favorite places, and a lot of people don't know about them, or they don't know that they're there. You may have heard of the term cedar glade to refer to these areas, but they're really open rocky areas within upland woodlands, but they're naturally that way. So they're characterized by thin soils, exposed rock, and very few trees. The term cedar glade comes to where, in fact, because of a lack of fire on our landscape, cedars have now encroached into our glades and completely taken them over. So they just look like part of the closed canopy forest system, when in fact they're not. And they're very unique ecosystems. They're almost like little mini deserts here within Arkansas, because a lot of the plants and animals that we find on glades are desert-like. So there's scorpions and tarantulas and reptiles. They're very shallow soils, very rocky. So we find a lot of species that you might find in a desert. So they're very unique, interesting little habitats within our forested areas. They're typically found on south and west facing slopes. There's a lot of glades in the northwest part in the Ozark Mountains, and also in the Ouachitas. We find a lot of these glades. And so they're managed, if you have a glade site on your property, it's removing trees and putting fire back on the landscape. And that's how we're going to manage those sites. You do want to be careful with glades. You don't want to put heavy equipment on them because, again, very thin soils, exposed rock, very prone to erosion and soil and compaction. So we want to keep heavy equipment off of them. And then we also want to make sure that we're not, if you're clearing trees off, especially cedars, we want to make sure we're not burning piles of cedar right on top of these glades, because we run the risk of actually scorching the soil. So if you're doing a glade restoration project, you can move those cedars off of the site and then burn them elsewhere, because we really don't want to damage that soil. It's very thin. So again, yes, glades are open rocky areas found within these upland woodlands, shallow soils, but yes, special considerations: avoid burning those heavy fuel loads to prevent that soil scorching. Put that in there twice. Here's a picture, or a couple pictures of some glades. So these are some dolomite glades that we find, but as you can see in these pictures, again, very, very rocky. This exposed rocks, the flowers that are growing, the grasses are growing, but they're very open. They're surrounded by trees, woodlands, and these are just open areas where trees just didn't historically grow very well, and fire maintained those open conditions. So they're absolutely amazing little sites, and I would love to see more glade restoration projects going on across the state. And then some additional practices that we have, that edge feathering I referred to earlier. So it is essentially creating transition zones between forest and open areas using either down trees, so we're talking about using the cedar trees earlier, or even native shrubby cover. They are not brush piles. So brush piles, what we generally refer to as a brush pile, are often too thick and they contain a lot of dirt and other debris that essentially renders them useless for being used for shrubby cover. Again, they're created by taking the down trees and you lay them out along the edge of the woodline. I've got a picture here on the next slide. Or by establishing those native shrub species, that also works. And it provides instant cover for wildlife and makes use of those undesirable trees that we're getting rid of within our forest lands. Snag creation is another great practice that we can use. A snag is essentially a standing, dead or dying tree. And as that tree dies and as it decays, animals can get in there and use the cavities that are formed, or create their own cavities, to use them for either nesting or for forage. So dead and dying trees, they host a lot of insects that things can eat. So you either have snags on your property from natural death, or you can actually create them by, essentially killing the tree with chemical treatment, killing it, letting it stand. So that hack and squirt method works great for that. Size and location. So, they can really range in size. Obviously, the larger snags that are about 12 inches in diameter, about 15 feet tall, work best for our larger species like our owls and hawks and eagles. But there are even some species that can use trees that are much smaller than that. So you're like 4 inches in diameter at about 6 feet tall. Even those can be utilized by some of our smaller bird species for nesting or for bug foraging. And on average, you want about 4 of these snags per acre would be ideal for supporting wildlife species here in Arkansas. And again, some of the benefits are those nesting sites and insect production for forage. And I'm running a little over time. I'm going to try to get through this. So here's some pictures of the edge feathering, as you can see in this in the left picture. This landowner has gone out and he has dropped these cedar trees and has just laid them along the edge of the forest and the open grassland that he was in the process of converting into natives, and just laid them out. So that provides instant cover for a lot of our species, especially our quail. And then snags. So you can have, you know, the snag on the left, that's obviously a dead tree. It's been dead for a while. You can tell there's no leaves on it. It's lost most of its limbs. So that snag is at the end of its life. It's probably going to get ready to fall in not too much longer. But you can also have this snag like on the right, where it's still got this is what they have hard snags and soft snags. So a hard snag is a snag that's not quite that old, so it's still got quite a bit left in it before it actually falls to the ground and is no longer a snag anymore. So we find that a lot of our species prefer these hard snags versus the soft snags, because those soft snags, again, are near the end of their usefulness for our wildlife. So monitoring and management. Albert Einstein, here's another quote, said, "Life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving forward." So again, just because you think you're done, you're not done. We want to monitor what we've been doing. So again, where your objectives met, you should have short-term and long-term goals. Boots on the ground, keep an eye on things. Walk your property, see what's going on once you've gotten the work completed. Are you seeing an increase in wildlife? You know, and document these things, write this stuff down, take pictures, document your successes and failures, because that will help you to maybe change up your plans if something's not working. Which brings us to the management. Adaptive management is management based on observation and what is currently on the ground. There's not a cookie cutter plan out there that works for every site, because as I said, they're all unique. Managing with prescribed fire is one of the best management tools we have. You're looking at about 3 times within the first 5 years from thinning, and about 5 times within the first 10 years following a thinning. That's about how often you want to rotate your burn cycle. And following that, you can push it back to maybe a 3 to 5 year rotation. But again, it's going out there every year and looking at it and seeing what needs to be done. And then also continued work with biologists, foresters, and other specialists as it progresses. We love coming out and seeing things progress and seeing what's working and seeing what's not, because that helps us as planners to learn what to do better with next time, or what's working and what's not. So we'll end with some, just briefly, some assistance that's available. So we have technical assistance, as I mentioned, coming out doing site visits, writing management plans. We have lists of vendors and contractors of people that do this type of work, and also fact sheets and technical guidance. We do webinars and workshops such as this one. And that technical assistance can come from us as Quail Forever biologists. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission has private lands biologists. It's not the Arkansas Forestry Commission anymore. It is the Arkansas Department of Agriculture Forestry Division Department. They changed their name. They have foresters that can come out and write forestry management plans, and that is where, if you have a commercial objective for your property, I highly recommend reaching out to them, or reaching out to a private consulting forester to get a well-written management plan for commercial production. There's also cost share assistance that can help you to implement the practices we talked about. You know, there's certain eligibility requirements, but there's state and federal funding that's available. I have listed there a few of the programs that are available through NRCS, which is federal, through the USDA, and then the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission also has programs that are available for landowners. And I'd also want to mention our Quail Forever Habitat crew. So we have a crew here in Arkansas. If you draw a diagonal line, kind of catty corner through the state, they cover that northern section. But they do prescribe burning for landowners at no cost, as long as you have your fire breaks installed. And they also do some forest stand improvement or thinning projects. So if you're interested in any of that, that's another program that's out there that can potentially assist you in doing some forest management. Here are some pictures of the map. So the Arkansas Quail Forever Farm Bill Biologist. So my area is that dark blue. Katrina is in the purple. But these other areas, if you happen to be in another part of the state, we don't quite cover every county, but we can still help you out in any way we can. So if you're interested, definitely reach out to either one of them or the private lands biologist with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. We essentially all do the same job. So if we're not cover one of your counties, absolutely reach out to one of those PLBs and we can get you going. And here's just a good slide with some excellent links if you have any more questions or if you're just interested in getting a little bit more information. You can take a picture of this, but these are the websites for a plethora of agencies that can provide technical and financial assistance for anyone looking to do any management on their properties. So when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So everything's connected. You know, and doing this work is not the easiest work. It's not the funnest work, but by God, is it worth it? The rewards of doing management and helping to conserve our wildlife species, to me, is one of the most rewarding things that we can do. And when you take all these puzzle pieces and you put them together, it's an absolutely gorgeous picture. And I really hope any of you all that are on here that have forest land or any type of land for that matter, and you're interested in doing habitat improvements, I highly encourage you to reach out. This is the time to do it. There's a lot of resources available and a lot of people available to help you get it going. So with that, I ran a little bit over our time, but there is my contact information and Katrina's contact information. So we will go ahead and open it up for questions if we have any questions. Let's see. I'm seeing, I am not seeing any questions come through. So we'll give people a couple of minutes, and if for some reason you can't get to the chat box, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question that you'd prefer to ask in person as well. Yes, Sarah, I did see your post and I can get that to you. Okay, well, it doesn't, well, okay. I'm not seeing any questions come through, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And you all are more than welcome to go, or we'll be on here for a few more minutes. If anybody thinks of a question before they leave, we'll be on for a couple more minutes, so feel free to get with us.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.